Louise of Austria has long been a name buried under the towering shadow of Napoleon. To most, she was simply the young bride sent to Paris to secure a fragile alliance, the woman who gave birth to the King of Rome, and the wife who failed to follow her husband into exile. But history, when told only in fragments, can be misleading. Behind those familiar details lies a story of resilience, compromise, and reinvention. Imagine a princess raised in Vienna, taught to despise France as the enemy of her dynasty, only to be forced into marriage with the very man she had feared. Imagine the delicate balancing act of becoming Empress of France, beloved in public yet uncertain in private, while navigating one of the most glittering and treacherous courts in Europe. Her life was not only about Napoleon. After his fall, she stepped out of the shadow of the great conqueror and became something far more surprising. An independent ruler, a duchess with her own court in Parma, and a woman who dared to pursue personal happiness on her own terms. For decades she governed with a steadiness few expected, even as her private life was marked by love, loss, and painful choices. Her journey forces us to look again at how we judge women in history. Was she weak, or was she quietly strong? Was she disloyal, or was she pragmatic? Marie-Louise's story is not about battlefield victories or monumental defeats. It is about endurance. It is about finding agency in a world designed to deny it. And above all, it is about a woman who lived through one of the most turbulent chapters in European history and yet managed to leave her own mark, even if it has too often been overlooked. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video we are going to uncover the unseen narrative of Marie-Louise, tracing her extraordinary journey from Austrian princess to Empress of France and finally to Duchess of Parma, where she carved out a legacy of her own. Marie-Louise of Austria is often remembered only as Napoleon's second wife, a woman whose name appears in the footnotes of history when the rise and fall of the French emperor are told. Yet her life was far more than a supporting role in the story of a man. She was born into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, the Hapsburgs, and her path from a sheltered princess to an Empress of France, and then later to a duchess ruling in her own right, is a story that speaks of duty, sacrifice, and the quiet endurance of a woman placed at the center of Europe's greatest political struggles. She entered the world in the year 1791, the second child of Emperor Francis II of Austria and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily. Her childhood was marked by the turbulence of a Europe caught in the storm of the French Revolution. While she was still a girl, the revolution's most famous figure, Napoleon Bonaparte, had risen from relative obscurity to become the most feared general on the continent. For the Hapsburg family, Napoleon represented not only a military threat, but also the embodiment of everything they opposed, a challenge to royal authority, tradition, and dynastic stability. Marie-Louise grew up hearing her family's distrust and resentment of Napoleon. Her early education was steeped in loyalty to her dynasty and religion, and she was taught to view the French emperor as a usurper and enemy of the old order. As a teenager, she witnessed her homeland defeated in wars against him, treaties signed under humiliating terms, and the shrinking of her father's empire. This created a deep fear and dislike of Napoleon in her, feelings that would later be tested when she became the unexpected instrument of diplomacy. By the first decade of the 19th century, Napoleon's conquests had reshaped Europe. After divorcing his first wife, Josephine, in his quest for a male heir, he looked to secure a political alliance with one of the great royal houses. The Hapsburgs, despite their history of animosity with him, saw advantage in such a match. For Emperor Francis, giving his daughter's hand to Napoleon was a way to ensure temporary peace and protection for Austria. For Marie-Louise, it was a bitter twist of fate. At 19 years of age, she was told she would marry the man she had been taught to fear. She had no voice in the matter. Her wedding in 1810 was arranged with all the ceremony that suited an imperial match, but beneath the pageantry lay her unease and reluctance. She entered France not as a willing bride, but as a dutiful daughter of her house. To Napoleon, the marriage brought legitimacy and the prospect of heirs who could secure his dynasty. To Marie-Louise, it was a sacrifice of personal feeling to political necessity. Her letters from this time reveal her discomfort, but also her determination to perform the role expected of her. Once in France, she adapted with a quiet strength that surprised many. Though she had little initial affection for Napoleon, he treated her with courtesy, and in time she grew to accept, if not entirely love, her role as his consort. The birth of their son in 1811, Napoleon Francis, gave her new purpose. Known as the King of Rome from infancy, the child was the symbol of Napoleon's ambitions and the hope of the French Empire. For Marie-Louise, he was not only her son but also her anchor in a foreign land where she still felt herself a stranger. Her years as empress coincided with the peak and then the decline of Napoleon's empire. She accompanied him to official functions, learned to navigate the French court, and presented an image of stability and respectability. Yet the world around her was shifting rapidly. Napoleon's disastrous campaign in Russia in 1812, followed by defeats across Europe, brought the empire to the edge of collapse. When the Allied powers closed in on France in 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. At that moment, Marie-Louise faced a difficult choice. Her loyalty to him as a husband was weighed against her loyalty to her family and her son's future. Under the guidance of her father and Austrian ministers, she withdrew from France, taking her son with her. This decision, which many in France saw as abandonment, can also be understood as the inevitable act of a woman caught between two great powers. After Napoleon's exile to Elba, she was given the duchies of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastella to rule. In this role, she found a kind of independence that she had never known as empress. In Parma, she focused on governance, art, and the welfare of her territories. She also began a relationship with Adam Albert von Neipperg, an Austrian general who became her companion and later, her husband after Napoleon's death. For much of the rest of her life, she would be more a Duchess of Parma than the widow of an. Her relationship with her son was more complex. After Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815 and his exile to St. Helena, her son was stripped of his French titles and raised in Vienna as the Duke of Reichstadt. He was separated from his mother, brought up under the watchful eye of his grandfather, and he died at the age of 21 from illness, never having played the political role his birth seemed to promise. For Marie-Louise, this was perhaps the deepest wound of her life, a separation forced upon her by dynastic politics. The rest of her years were spent in Parma, where she established herself as a capable ruler. She invested in public works, supported the arts, and tried to bring stability to her duchy. Though never a figure of fiery passion or political ambition, she represented steadiness and responsibility, qualities that earned her a measure of respect from her subjects. Yet her story has often been neglected or simplified. Historians long treated her as a passive figure, overshadowed by Napoleon's towering presence. She has been depicted as a timid girl married off against her will, or as a woman who abandoned her husband in his time of need. Such portrayals ignore the pressures and constraints she faced. As a princess of the Hapsburgs, her marriage was never her own to choose. As Empress of France, she was caught in the rise and fall of an empire not of her making. As Duchess of Parma, she exercised more control, but even then her rule was guided by the expectations of her family and the Austrian court. What makes her story worth revisiting is not only her connection to Napoleon, but also what her life reveals about the women of her age. She lived at a time when dynastic marriages were instruments of politics, and personal happiness was often sacrificed for the sake of treaties and alliances. Her journey from Habsburg princess to French empress to Italian duchess shows how women could serve as both pawns and players in the political chessboard of Europe. She was more than Napoleon's second wife. She was a daughter, a mother, a ruler, and a woman who endured personal sacrifice under the weight of history. While she may never have sought power or glory, her life intersected with the greatest events of her century. To see her only through the lens of Napoleon is to miss the deeper story of resilience, adaptation, and quiet influence. From the moment she was born in the halls of the Hapsburg court to her final days in Parma in 1847, Marie-Louise lived through revolution, war, empire, and restoration. She carried titles she did not choose and bore responsibilities that were imposed upon her. Yet she managed to shape her own path within those constraints, leaving behind a legacy that deserves attention. Her unseen narrative is one of survival in a world where women like her had little control, but where their presence shaped the destinies of nations. Marie-Louise's story cannot be fully understood without returning to the world of her childhood, long before she became Napoleon's empress and later the Duchess of Parma. Her beginnings as an Austrian princess shaped her views, her sense of duty, and the way she responded to the immense pressures that defined her adult life. To understand the decisions she made, the way she endured personal sacrifice, and the manner in which she balanced the conflicting demands of family, dynasty, and empire, it is necessary to look at the atmosphere in which she grew up. She was born in Vienna in the year 1791, the second child of Emperor Francis II of Austria and his second wife, Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily. At the time of her birth, her family represented one of the most important dynasties in Europe, the Hapsburgs, who had for centuries shaped continental politics. Yet the timing of her entry into the world could not have been more precarious. The French Revolution was transforming the old order, threatening monarchies across Europe, and laying the foundation for Napoleon's rise. The Habsburgs, who had been connected to the French royal family through marriage, felt the shock of the revolution personally when Marie Antoinette, sister of Emperor Francis and Queen of France, was executed in Paris in 1793. This tragedy left a lasting mark on the imperial household and became part of the atmosphere in which Marie-Louise grew up. From the beginning, her life was tied to loss as well as duty. Her mother, Maria Theresa, died when Marie-Louise was still very young. The death of her mother left her with only faint memories of maternal affection and created a void that was filled instead by tutors, governesses, and the strict routines of court life. The absence of her mother would shape her emotional world, making her rely heavily on her sense of family duty and on the figures of authority who guided her. In this sense, she grew up as something of an orphan within the walls of the Hapsburg palace, more the child of dynasty than of parents. The court of Vienna, with its elaborate traditions and rules, formed the backdrop of her early years. It was a world defined by rank, duty, and appearances. From an early age, she was taught to carry herself as a daughter of the Hapsburg line, one of the most prestigious families in Europe. The empire she was born into was both a shield and a burden. Its long legacy gave her a sense of pride, but it also imposed expectations that she could not escape. Every action, every word, every lesson was framed by the knowledge that she was not an ordinary child, but one whose life might someday be used in the service of the state. Her education reflected these priorities. She was instructed not only in the usual subjects of royal children, such as languages, history, and religion, but also in the manners and disciplines that would prepare her for diplomatic marriage. She learned French, Italian, and Latin, along with music and painting, but perhaps more importantly, she absorbed the values of obedience, modesty, and piety. She developed a personality marked by reserve and restraint, qualities that were prized in a Hapsburg daughter. She was neither a rebel nor a visionary, but rather a young woman trained to fit seamlessly into the dynastic strategies of her family. At the same time, her early years were shadowed by the political struggles of her father's reign. Austria faced defeat after defeat at the hands of the French armies, and treaties were signed that chipped away at Hapsburg lands and prestige. These developments were not hidden from the imperial children. Marie-Louise grew up hearing about battles lost, about Napoleon's relentless advances, and about the humiliation of her father's empire. In this climate, she learned to view Napoleon not only as an enemy of Austria, but as a personal adversary. Her tutors, loyal to the dynasty, reinforced this perspective, filling her mind with stories of the suffering Napoleon caused across Europe. By the time she reached her teenage years, she despised him, considering him a ruthless usurper who had brought disgrace to her family. This combination of dynastic pride, personal loss, and political animosity shaped her character in lasting ways. She was dutiful, serious, and careful not to attract disapproval. Unlike some royal children who pushed against the limits of their upbringing, Marie-Louise accepted them. She did not dream of freedom or independence, but rather prepared herself for the life she assumed would be hers, that of a wife to some foreign prince, bound by the alliances and calculations of her father's ministers. In this sense, she was from the beginning a political pawn. Her life was not her own to direct, but rather an asset to be used in the great game of European diplomacy. The Habsburgs had for centuries secured peace and influence through marriages, and Marie-Louise understood that this would be her destiny as well. She might be sent to Italy, to Spain, or to some smaller German principality, depending on what the political circumstances required. There was no question that she would marry for love. Her role was to represent her family and to bear children who would secure alliances. Her early experiences also instilled in her a habit of endurance. Without a mother, with a distant father who was more emperor than parent, and with the constant weight of duty, she learned not to expect much in the way of personal happiness. Instead, she valued stability, routine, and the approval of authority figures. This inclination would later help her adjust to her unexpected role as Empress of France. Though she did not love Napoleon at first, she carried with her the lessons of her upbringing: obey, adapt, and survive. The young princess's life in Vienna was not without small pleasures. She enjoyed music, embroidery, and the companionship of her sisters. She liked to ride horses and took part in the formal entertainments of the court. But even these moments of joy were framed by the expectations of her rank. She was always conscious that she was being prepared for a greater purpose, and that her personal desires mattered less than her future usefulness to the dynasty. In looking back at this part of her life, it becomes clear why Marie-Louise has often been misunderstood. To those who expect dramatic rebellion or romantic passion, her story can seem passive. But her quiet demeanor was not weakness. It was the product of a childhood shaped by loss, by dynastic obligation, and by the harsh realities of European politics at the turn of the 19th century. She survived by accepting her role and by finding ways to adapt to the circumstances imposed on her. This childhood also explains the choices she made later. When she married Napoleon, despite her fear and dislike of him, she did so with the same sense of duty she had been trained to uphold. When she withdrew from France after his abdication, guided by her father's ministers, she did so as the daughter of Austria who had been taught that loyalty to her dynasty must outweigh all else. When she ruled Parma with steadiness and without seeking glory, she reflected the habits of a woman who valued stability over drama. Her early life in Vienna, therefore, was not merely a prelude to her marriage to Napoleon. It was the foundation of her character, the crucible in which her values and habits were formed. It was here that she became the woman who would navigate the storms of empire and exile. It was here that she learned to survive as a pawn in the hands of others, yet still find a measure of influence and responsibility. The years of Marie-Louise's youth in Vienna, shaped by the shadows of loss, dynastic duty, and deep-seated fear of Napoleon, led her directly into one of the most dramatic turns of her life. The lessons instilled in her as a girl, the acceptance of sacrifice, the willingness to obey her family's wishes, and the ability to endure, were suddenly tested in a way she could not have imagined. From the halls of the Hapsburg palace, where she had listened to accounts of Napoleon's destruction across Europe, she was thrust into a role that demanded she become his bride, his empress, and the mother of his hoped-for dynasty. To Marie-Louise, this transition from enemy to wife of the French emperor was nothing less than shocking, and it marked a moment when her personal life was overtaken entirely by the needs of an empire. The year was 1810 when negotiations began in earnest. Napoleon, after years of conquest, had reached a point where he needed legitimacy more than fresh victories. His first marriage, to Josephine de Beauharnais, had ended in divorce because she had failed to provide him with an heir. For all his military triumphs, his power was fragile without a dynasty to succeed him. He set his sights on the great royal houses of Europe, knowing that a union with a well-established family would provide not only the possibility of heirs, but also a sense of permanence and recognition for his empire. The Hapsburgs, long his bitter rivals, seemed an unlikely choice. Austria had suffered repeated defeats at his hands, and Marie-Louise herself had been raised to despise him. But Emperor Francis I, calculating and pragmatic, saw advantage in such a match. Austria was exhausted by years of war, its armies weakened, and its treasury strained. An alliance through marriage might spare further humiliation and preserve what remained of Habsburg power. To Francis, his daughter's marriage was a tool of diplomacy, a means of buying time and stability. To Marie-Louise, it was a sentence passed down with no opportunity for appeal. When she was told she would marry Napoleon, her reaction was one of dread. She had been taught to fear him as a monster who had destroyed kingdoms and desecrated traditions. She confided in her letters to her governess that she felt as if she were being sacrificed, offered to a man she neither respected nor wished to know. But true to her upbringing, she did not rebel. She did not refuse. She accepted the decision as her duty, another step in the life of obedience that had been set. The wedding itself was a spectacle designed to impress. In March of 1810, after the necessary treaties and agreements had been signed, the proxy wedding took place in Vienna, with Napoleon represented by one of his officials. Marie-Louise was then escorted to France, where she would meet her husband for the first time. The journey was filled with ceremonies and public displays, but for the young bride it was a journey into the unknown. She was leaving behind her family, her homeland, and the only life she had ever known. In their place awaited a man she feared, and a people she did not understand. When she first met Napoleon at Compiègne, the encounter was far from the nightmare she had imagined. He greeted her warmly, with charm and courtesy. Napoleon, who knew the importance of appearances, understood that his new bride needed reassurance, not intimidation. He made efforts to present himself not as the feared conqueror, but as a husband eager to please. This first impression softened her fear, though it could not erase the reluctance she felt. In Paris, the celebrations continued with grandeur. Their official wedding at the Louvre and the subsequent religious ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral placed her firmly before the eyes of Europe. She was dressed in splendor, surrounded by the glitter of court, and presented as the new Empress of France. Yet behind the shining image was a young woman of 19 who had been torn from her world and placed on display as the symbol of an alliance. The public saw the match as a triumph of diplomacy, a sign that even the great Hapsburgs now bowed to Napoleon's might. But the private reality was much more complex. In those first months, Marie-Louise struggled to adjust. She had been raised in a court known for its formality and restraint, but the French court was vibrant, unpredictable, and filled with factions. She found herself the focus of attention, her every gesture observed, her every word repeated. She was compared constantly to Josephine, who still lingered in the affections of many at court. She wrote home about her discomfort, her sense of isolation, and her yearning for familiar faces. Napoleon, however, did not neglect her. Though he was absorbed in the affairs of empire, he took care to treat her with kindness. He gave her gifts, spent time with her, and sought to win her affection. To his surprise, and perhaps to hers as well, a relationship slowly developed between them. It was not a romance born of passion in the beginning, but of mutual adaptation. She, taught to obey and endure, began to find in him qualities she had not expected. He could be attentive, even gentle, when it suited him. She discovered a man who, though often harsh with others, showed her a form of respect. The birth of their son in March of 1811 cemented their bond. The child, named Napoleon Francis Charles Joseph, but better known as the King of Rome, was the heir that Napoleon had longed for and the reason he had sought marriage to a royal house. For Marie-Louise, the arrival of her son brought joy and a sense of purpose. In motherhood, she found stability and an anchor amid the constant swirl of politics and public life. She devoted herself to the infant with affection that had been absent in her own childhood, perhaps trying to give him the warmth she had been denied after the loss of her mother. The world, however, saw in the child not only a baby but a symbol. He was the future of the French Empire, the living connection between the upstart emperor and the ancient house of Hapsburg. For Napoleon, he was proof that his dynasty was secure. For Austria, he was both a reassurance and a risk, tying their bloodline to a man they still feared. For Marie-Louise, he was simply her son, though she could not escape the weight of expectations placed upon him. Despite the careful public image, private challenges remained. Marie-Louise continued to feel the strain of living in a foreign land. She missed her family, especially her sisters, and often sought comfort in writing letters home. Her relationship with Napoleon, though not marked by passionate love, was steady, but it was never entirely free from imbalance. He was the emperor, commanding not only his armies but also his household, and she was expected to follow. The contrast between public perception and private reality defined her life in these years. To the French people and to much of Europe, she was the symbol of a grand alliance, the serene empress who stood beside Napoleon at ceremonies and shared in his triumphs. To herself, she was a young woman still learning to reconcile duty with feeling, caught between the pride of her new role and the homesickness that never truly faded. What makes her story compelling in this period is not only the political weight of the marriage, but the human side of it. Against her will, she had been placed in the orbit of the most powerful man in Europe, and instead of collapsing under the strain, she adapted. She found ways to coexist with him, to create a life within the constraints given to her. There was even a measure of growth in her relationship with Napoleon, for while she may never have loved him with passion, she came to accept him with a sense of companionship. The years between her marriage and the fall of the empire were a period of transformation for Marie-Louise. She moved from frightened bride to mother of an heir, from an Austrian princess resenting her fate to an empress who played her part with dignity. Yet the fragility of the empire would soon test her again. The Russia campaign in 1812, the defeats that followed, and the growing coalition of powers against France would soon reveal the limits of her stability. Still, in this moment of her life, she embodied the dual role that defined so many royal women of her age. She was both the face of a political alliance and a human being trying to find comfort, love, and meaning within it. Her unseen narrative here lies in the small adjustments, the quiet endurance, and the private moments that rarely make it into history books, but without which her life cannot be fully understood. Life as Empress of the French required Marie-Louise to master a world that was at once dazzling and suffocating, filled with rituals, expectations, and politics that constantly reminded her she was no longer the daughter of the Hapsburg court, but the consort of a man who ruled much of Europe. The transition from reluctant bride to empress and mother did not come easily, yet she managed it with the quiet strength and composure that had been instilled in her since childhood. What set her apart during this period was not dramatic rebellion or passionate ambition, but her steady capacity to adapt, to accept her circumstances, and to find ways to carry out her role with dignity, even when she felt overwhelmed. The French imperial court was unlike the rigid formality of Vienna. At the Hofburg, her life had been guided by a system steeped in centuries of tradition, where every gesture was carefully measured and rules were unyielding. Paris was different. Napoleon's empire was still relatively young, its court a blend of old aristocracy, ambitious generals, and newcomers elevated by his victories. It was a place of rivalries, jealousies, and shifting alliances. For Marie-Louise, this environment was both bewildering and intimidating. She was constantly compared to Josephine, whose charm and warmth had left a deep impression on many. Marie-Louise, by contrast, was more reserved, and her natural shyness made her seem distant in a court that prized display and charisma. Yet she did not collapse under the weight of these expectations. She adapted by relying on the skills she had cultivated since childhood, observing carefully, speaking little, and maintaining composure. She knew that her position was not secured by popularity alone, but by her symbolic role as the embodiment of the alliance between France and Austria. In public, she presented herself as serene and obedient, fulfilling her duties as empress with grace. She appeared at official ceremonies, presided over social functions, and stood beside Napoleon as a visible reminder of his legitimacy. In private, however, her feelings were far more complex. She continued to miss her homeland and often wrote letters to her family in Austria, expressing both her longing for home and her determination to carry out her responsibilities. Napoleon's attentions helped her adjust, for he treated her with care in the early years of their marriage. While their relationship lacked the passionate devotion he had once shown to Josephine, it developed into one of mutual respect and even tenderness at times. Marie-Louise, who had entered the marriage with dread, slowly discovered that she could coexist with this man who had once been her greatest fear. The turning point in her life as empress came with the birth of her son in March of 1811. The arrival of the King of Rome was not only a personal joy, but also a political triumph. For Napoleon, the birth of a male heir secured the dynasty he had longed for and justified his decision to divorce Josephine. For France, it was a moment of celebration, a sign that the empire had a future. For Austria, it was both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because it linked their bloodline with Napoleon's, but troubling because it created a child who might one day be used to challenge their own power. For Marie-Louise, the child was above all her own. She threw herself into motherhood with a devotion that surprised many around her. Having grown up with little maternal affection, she gave to her son the tenderness she had long craved. She spent hours with him, overseeing his care, holding him in her arms, and delighting in the small milestones of his infancy. Unlike many royal mothers of her time, who left the raising of their children almost entirely to governesses, she insisted on being present, shaping his early life with her warmth. Motherhood also transformed her role at court. No longer seen simply as a foreign bride brought in to cement an alliance, she now embodied the continuity of Napoleon's dynasty. The image of the empress with her infant son was used in art, propaganda, and ceremony to reinforce the idea that the empire was not temporary, but secure for generations to come. In portraits and public appearances, Marie-Louise held the child as a symbol of hope and legitimacy, a living testament to the stability of the imperial throne. Yet beneath the surface of this joy lay the growing cracks in Napoleon's empire. The year following the birth of their son, Napoleon embarked on his ill-fated campaign to Russia in 1812. Marie-Louise was left in Paris, expected to carry out ceremonial duties in his absence and to serve as a symbol of continuity. She played her part faithfully, appearing at functions, offering reassurances, and projecting calm, even as rumors of disaster filtered back from the front. Her training in composure served her well, for she did not betray fear in public, though privately she worried about her husband and the fate of the empire. When the Russian campaign ended in catastrophe, the stability of the empire began to unravel. The Allied powers, emboldened by Napoleon's defeat, pressed forward. In these years of decline, Marie-Louise's loyalty was tested as never before. She remained at her husband's side when she could, and when he left her in charge of Paris during his campaigns, she dutifully carried out the responsibilities entrusted to her. Her role was not one of active governance, but of symbolic steadiness. She received delegations, presided over ceremonies, and maintained the image of an empire that was still functioning. Her choices during this period reveal much about her character. She did not attempt to assert independent political power, for she had never been trained or encouraged to do so. Instead, she relied on the guidance of her father's ministers and Napoleon's advisors, performing the duties expected of her with calm obedience. Yet the very fact that she did not falter, that she did not rebel or withdraw, shows her resilience. She may not have been a figure of fiery ambition, but she embodied the quiet loyalty of a woman fulfilling the role she had been given, even as the world around her was collapsing. Her loyalty was not without conflict. As Austria joined the coalition against France, she found herself caught between her birth family and her husband. Her father and his ministers urged her to think of her son's future and of Austria's survival, while Napoleon expected her unwavering support. The strain of this divided loyalty weighed heavily on her. In her letters, she sometimes revealed her confusion and sorrow, admitting that she longed for peace but could not bear to see her husband destroyed. The fall of Paris in 1814 marked the end of her life as Napoleon's empress in more ways than one. As the Allies closed in, she faced choices no woman of her age should have had to make. She wished to stand by her son and protect him above all else. Napoleon, forced to abdicate, hoped she might advocate for him or join him in exile. But the Austrian court had already decided her path. Under the influence of her father and his advisors, she withdrew from France, taking her son with her. To many French loyalists, this felt like betrayal, but from her perspective it was the only way to secure the child's safety. She was still the dutiful daughter of Austria, still bound by the lessons of obedience she had learned in Vienna. The years of her marriage to Napoleon were defined by contradictions. Publicly, she was the serene empress who gave him legitimacy and bore him an heir. Privately, she was a young woman grappling with fear, homesickness, and the impossible weight of her position. She showed loyalty, but it was a loyalty shaped as much by duty as by affection. She grew to accept her husband, and in moments perhaps even to care for him, but her true devotion was always to her son and to the survival of her family. In the shadow of Napoleon, she was not the towering figure of ambition or tragedy that history often celebrates. Instead, she was something subtler but no less important. A woman who endured, who adapted, and who navigated her way through the storms of empire with a steadiness that deserves recognition. Her story in these years reminds us that loyalty can take many forms, and that sometimes the quietest choices are also the hardest. When the great collapse of Napoleon's empire came in the spring of 1814, Marie-Louise found herself at a crossroads that would determine the rest of her life. She was only 23 years old, widowed in all but name, the mother of a child who had once been hailed as the future of an empire but was now caught between dynasties, and a woman whose loyalties had always been divided between her Hapsburg birthright and her role as Empress of the French. In that moment, when her husband was forced to abdicate and exiled to the island of Elba, her path diverged from his forever. She did not follow him into exile, as some wives of fallen monarchs might have done. Instead, she entered a new phase of her life, one in which she would be more than a consort or a pawn. She became the sovereign Duchess of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastella, a ruler in her own right. The decision not to join Napoleon was not entirely hers, though it has often been judged harshly. Her father, Emperor Francis of Austria, and his ministers made it clear that her destiny was to return to her Hapsburg family and secure the future of her son. They offered her Parma as a duchy to rule, a place that would give her independence while keeping her under Austria's watchful influence. For Marie-Louise, the choice was wrapped in both sorrow and pragmatism. She still felt some affection for Napoleon, who had treated her with a measure of kindness, but she was not prepared to abandon her family or her child's inheritance for a life of obscurity alongside a man stripped of power. Her sense of duty, drilled into her from childhood, guided her decision once again. Arriving in Parma in 1815, Marie-Louise stepped into a role that was new for her. that of a ruler with her own court, her own subjects, and her own responsibilities. The Duchy of Parma was not large compared to the great powers of Europe, but it offered her a stage on which she could finally exercise authority in her own name. For the first time, she was not simply the wife of an emperor or the daughter of one. She was the Duchess of Parma, and the decisions made in her territory would reflect her judgment. The challenges she faced were real. Parma was a small but proud duchy in northern Italy, and its people were wary of foreign rule. Many had expected the duchy to be restored to its previous rulers, and the arrival of a Hapsburg princess, imposed upon them by the Congress of Vienna, did not immediately inspire affection. Marie-Louise had to win over a population that viewed her with suspicion, while also navigating the constant oversight of Austrian officials who wished to ensure that she remained loyal to Vienna's interests. In these circumstances, she revealed a side of her character that history often overlooks. She proved to be a capable and conscientious ruler. She devoted attention to the welfare of her duchy, supporting public works, improving infrastructure, and patronizing the arts. She sought to balance the expectations of her subjects with the demands of Austria, often walking a delicate line between independence and obedience. Though she had never been trained for active political leadership, her temperament of steadiness and caution suited the role. Unlike her husband Napoleon, who had thrived on ambition and conquest, she found satisfaction in stability and quiet progress. Her years in Parma also gave her something she had rarely known before, a degree of personal freedom. No longer overshadowed by Napoleon or entirely controlled by her father, she began to shape her own identity. This was visible not only in her governance, but also in her personal life. In Parma, she entered into a relationship with Adam Albert von Neipperg, an Austrian general assigned as her advisor and companion. Neipperg was a widower, older than she, and he provided her with affection, stability, and companionship at a time when she desperately needed it. Their bond deepened quickly, and though it caused whispers in European courts, for Marie-Louise it represented a chance at personal happiness. Her relationship with Neipperg marked a turning point in her emotional world. With him, she experienced something that her marriage to Napoleon had never truly given her, a sense of choice and affection without the overwhelming weight of empire. They had children together, further cementing their union, and in many ways they lived as though married even before Napoleon's death. When news came in 1821 that Napoleon had died in exile on St. Helena, Marie-Louise mourned him with decorum, but did not waver in her commitment to Neipperg. Later that same year, she and Neipperg married in secret, formalizing the partnership that had already defined her life in Parma. This decision, while controversial in some circles, reflected her quiet determination to live on her own terms at last. For once, she was not being moved like a chess piece by dynasties or ministers. She had chosen her companion, and she had chosen to create a family that brought her comfort. Critics later accused her of forgetting Napoleon too quickly, but such judgments ignore the context of her life. She had never entered her first marriage by choice, and while she had come to accept Napoleon with a sense of duty and even mild affection, she had never loved him deeply. Her loyalty had always been shaped by responsibility rather than passion. With Neipperg, she embraced a life closer to her own desires. As a duchess, she remained devoted to Parma. She expanded her patronage of music and culture, befitting a city with such strong artistic traditions. She supported charities and took an interest in the well-being of her subjects. While she was never a radical reformer, she established a reputation for fairness and stability. The people of Parma gradually accepted her, and over time she was remembered more fondly than many had predicted at the outset. She may not have transformed her duchy, but she gave it a period of relative peace and prosperity in a century often marked by upheaval. Her son, however, remained a source of sorrow. After Napoleon's defeat, the boy, known as the King of Rome in France but reduced to the title Duke of Reichstadt in Austria, was taken from her custody and raised in Vienna under the strict supervision of his grandfather, Emperor Francis. Marie-Louise had little influence over his upbringing and saw him only rarely. She grieved this separation deeply, for he had been her anchor during her years in France. The loss of her son's daily presence was perhaps the greatest wound of her life. When he died of tuberculosis in 1832 at the age of 21, Marie-Louise was devastated. She had outlived the child who had once symbolized the future of an empire, and the sense of helplessness that had defined her separation from him haunted her. Her personal losses did not end there. Neipperg, the man who had given her companionship and stability, died in 1829. His death left her widowed once again, this time in a relationship she had chosen for herself. In the years that followed, she leaned increasingly on her children from her union with him, as well as on her responsibilities as Duchess. She later remarried morganatically to Charles René de Bombelles, a courtier and diplomat, who provided her with support in her later years, though their relationship lacked the closeness she had shared with Neipperg. Despite these personal sorrows, Marie-Louise continued to govern Parma until her death in 1847. Over more than 3 decades, she established herself as a consistent and steady ruler. She did not seek to reshape Europe as her first husband had tried to do, nor did she aspire to leave behind dramatic legacies of conquest or reform. Instead, she gave her duchy a measure of stability in an era when many regions of Italy were racked by revolution and conflict. She was remembered not as a conqueror or visionary, but as a duchess who fulfilled her duties with dignity. In the broader sweep of history, her later life has often been overshadowed by her years as Napoleon's empress. Yet in many ways, her story in Parma is more revealing. It shows how a woman who had once been nothing more than a pawn in dynastic politics managed to carve out a space for herself, to find personal happiness, and to exercise authority in her own right. It illustrates how she navigated the expectations of her dynasty while still finding room for her own choices. Her narrative, often dismissed as secondary to Napoleon's, deserves a more balanced view. She was not simply the timid girl handed over to a conqueror, nor the wife who abandoned her husband in his downfall. She was also the Duchess of Parma, a woman who governed, who loved, who suffered loss, and who persevered. Her life reminds us that history is not only made by the towering figures of ambition and glory, but also by those who, in quieter ways, sustain communities, adapt to circumstances, and find meaning in roles they did not choose. From her birth in Vienna in 1791 to her death in Parma in 1847, Marie-Louise lived through revolution, empire, and restoration. She was Empress of France, mother of the King of Rome, companion of Neipperg, and Duchess of Parma. At every stage, she carried with her the lessons of her Hapsburg childhood: the primacy of duty, the habit of obedience, and the strength of endurance. Yet she also found moments of personal freedom and choice, carving out spaces where she could be more than just a symbol. In the end, her life was not one of great drama or ambition, but it was a life of resilience, adaptation, and quiet influence, qualities that deserve remembrance alongside the more famous figures of her age. The story of Marie-Louise does not end with her death in Parma in 1847. Her life, though seemingly quiet compared to the dramatic rise and fall of Napoleon, left behind a legacy that has too often been diminished or misunderstood. For much of history, she has been treated as a supporting character, a woman defined almost entirely by her marriage to the most powerful man of her age and by the fact that she bore him a son. Yet to see her only through this lens is to miss the depth of her resilience and the subtle ways she shaped her own destiny within the constraints of her time. When we look closely, her story is one not only of survival but of agency, and it speaks to questions of female power, historical memory, and the way we understand political influence in a world designed to limit women. It is true that Marie-Louise's early life was marked by obedience. From the death of her mother in her childhood to her arranged marriage with Napoleon, she was shaped by forces beyond her control. Her destiny seemed to belong to her father, to her dynasty, and to the shifting needs of European diplomacy. But what is striking is the way she adapted to these pressures and, at key moments, made choices that allowed her to carve out a life that was partly her own. When she became Empress of France, she might have faltered under the weight of expectation, yet she embraced her role with steadiness, presenting herself as serene and capable even when she felt unsure. When Napoleon's empire collapsed, she did not tie herself to his exile, but accepted a duchy of her own, ruling with consistency and shaping Parma into a space of stability. When she formed her bond with Neipperg, she claimed personal happiness in a way that her dynastic marriage had never permitted. Each of these moments reveals agency, not in the dramatic, world-changing sense that history often rewards, but in the quieter choices that allowed her to survive and even to thrive. Her ability to maneuver within the boundaries of a patriarchal world is perhaps her most important legacy. Women of her rank were expected to serve as instruments of diplomacy, producing heirs and binding dynasties together, but they were rarely encouraged to exercise authority or seek fulfillment outside of those roles. Marie-Louise accepted these expectations outwardly, yet she found ways to expand the space available to her. As Duchess of Parma, she ruled for over 3 decades, longer than she had been Empress of France, and she did so with a degree of independence that many might not have predicted for the timid Austrian princess who once wept at the thought of marrying Napoleon. She demonstrated that even within the constraints of her age, a woman could govern with steadiness, build relationships that brought her personal contentment, and shape the lives of her subjects. Much of the misunderstanding about Marie-Louise's life stems from the way she has been judged in comparison to Napoleon. Because his story was so monumental, rising from obscurity to rule Europe, then falling in dramatic defeat, hers has often been cast in his shadow. Historians in the 19th century, especially those sympathetic to Napoleon, tended to portray her as disloyal for not following him into exile. They accused her of being cold, unfeeling, or indifferent to his fate. Such interpretations, however, overlook the impossible position in which she was placed. She was a daughter of Austria, a mother of a child whose future was uncertain, and a young woman of 23 asked to choose between a fallen husband and the security of her family and son. To condemn her for not joining Napoleon is to ignore the reality of her situation. Her decision may not have been romantic, but it was rational and protective, reflecting the same pragmatic survival instinct that had carried her through her earlier ordeals. Another misconception has been the idea that she was weak or passive, merely drifting through events without shaping them. This view disregards her decades of rule in Parma, where she consistently demonstrated responsibility and care for her subjects. It also ignores the courage required to build a new personal life with Hapsburg in defiance of gossip and courtly criticism. Passivity is not the right word for a woman who endured the collapse of an empire, the loss of her son, and the deaths of those she loved, yet continued to govern and maintain her role with steadiness. What appears as weakness from a distance may in fact have been resilience, a quieter strength that does not demand attention but proves itself in endurance. It is also important to recognize the biases in how female figures of history have been portrayed. Men like Napoleon are remembered for their ambition, their risks, and their triumphs, while women like Marie-Louise are often reduced to their relationships. She has been described as Napoleon's Austrian wife, far more often than as the Duchess of Parma. Yet if we shift the lens, her story can be seen differently. Not as a footnote to Napoleon's, but as a narrative of a woman navigating immense challenges with composure. To frame her only through the prism of Napoleon is to diminish the scope of her own achievements. Her enduring impact lies not in grand military campaigns or sweeping reforms, but in the example of how one can endure, adapt, and find agency within constraints. In this sense, her story resonates strongly with modern themes. In a world that often still debates the balance between societal expectations and personal choice for women, Marie-Louise's life offers a historical parallel. She shows that agency does not always mean overthrowing the system or seizing power directly. Sometimes it means surviving within the system, bending it slightly to create space for one's own identity and needs. Her ability to maintain dignity, to rule with fairness, and to secure personal happiness where she could are all forms of agency that remain relevant today. She also embodies the complexity of loyalty and survival. Her life forces us to ask difficult questions. Was she wrong to leave Napoleon behind? Was she wrong to build a life for herself in Parma with another man? Or was she simply responding as best she could to impossible circumstances? These questions do not have easy answers, but they highlight the ways in which women in history have been judged by harsher standards than men. Napoleon is celebrated for his pragmatism, his adaptability, and his pursuit of power, even when those pursuits caused immense suffering. Marie-Louise, when she displayed pragmatism and adaptability, was criticized for coldness or betrayal. Reimagining her legacy requires that we challenge those double standards and see her choices as rational, even courageous, in their own context. The tragedy of her son adds another dimension to her legacy. The boy who had once been hailed as the King of Rome lived and died in Vienna as the Duke of Reichstadt, never fulfilling the destiny Napoleon had dreamed for him. His short life, ending at 21, left Marie-Louise with a grief that was compounded by the fact that she had been separated from him for much of his upbringing. This loss underscores the limits of her power, reminding us that even in her role as Duchess, she could not control the fate of those dearest to her. Yet it also speaks to her humanity. Behind the political roles and titles, she was a mother who suffered profoundly, and her endurance through this loss is another mark of her quiet strength. In her final years, as she ruled Parma with a steady hand. She must have reflected on the strange course of her life. She had been born into the most illustrious dynasty in Europe, given in marriage to the continent's greatest conqueror, crowned Empress of the French, and then reduced, in the eyes of many, to a duchess of a small Italian state. Yet within this reduction lay her independence. Parma gave her space to shape her own legacy, to govern without the constant presence of a domineering husband, to pursue love on her own terms, and to live out her days with a sense of purpose. Her reign there may not have been revolutionary, but it was real, and it mattered to her subjects. Today, her story invites us to broaden our understanding of history. Not every legacy is written in conquest or revolution. Some are written in endurance, adaptation, and the quiet exercise of responsibility. Marie-Louise's life challenges the notion that power must be loud to be meaningful. She reminds us that resilience is itself a form of strength, and that survival in the face of overwhelming forces can be as significant as victory. When we reimagine her legacy beyond the shadow of Napoleon, we see a woman who is more than an empress consort. We see a child who endured early loss, a bride who accepted sacrifice for her dynasty, a mother who loved her son fiercely despite separation, a duchess who governed with fairness, and a woman who found love and companionship on her own terms. We see not just a figure moved by history, but a figure who moved within it with grace and determination. Her life still resonates because it reflects universal themes. The struggle between duty and desire, the challenge of finding agency within constraints, and the resilience required to navigate loss and change. In a world still grappling with questions of gender, power, and survival, her narrative feels strikingly relevant. She was not a conqueror, but she was a survivor, and in her survival lies her true strength. Thus, Marie-Louise's legacy should not be confined to a footnote beneath Napoleon's towering story. It should be remembered as its own narrative, the journey of a woman who, against the weight of dynasties and empires, carved out a life of dignity, resilience, and quiet influence. Hers is a story that speaks not only to the past but also to the present, reminding us that agency comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most enduring power is found not in conquest, but in endurance.